I'm a teacher of English language, and I think it's time to think again about the way that we teach theirs. And there are, there isn't, there's not, there aren't. The problem is that your English teacher might have lied to you. I'm going to explain why we should forget about there are and use theirs for everything. If you do choose to use there are, you should be pronouncing it there're. And why in negative there's not is just as common as there isn't. First things first, why am I saying use theirs for everything? Well, if you are a learner of English as a foreign language, or maybe you're a teacher of English as a foreign language, thank you for watching, you will have seen course books like this which love to insist that there is a difference between there is for singular and uncountable nouns, and there are, which we use, according to them, for plural nouns. So you've probably seen pages of books like this. I have some of them on shelves behind me here. You've probably seen online materials that say things like, there is a restaurant in the station, there are 2 cafes in the shopping centre. If you're a really unlucky learner of English, you may even have had to do some exercises like this, where you have to complete with there are for everything that's plural, and there is for everything that is singular. Now, of course, while it is perfectly correct to use there are with plurals, I think the distinction between there is and there are is something that is being lost over time. It is now, I would argue, perfectly normal and perfectly common to use theirs with plurals. Don't believe me? Let's listen to this man.
Childcare, creating a 7-day NHS, there's huge challenges.
Did you hear that?
Creating a 7-day NHS, there's huge challenges.
There's huge challenges. Challenges plural, but he says theirs. This could be one speaker who just misspoke, maybe just this one time. Let's see if that's the case. So you might have noticed that was former UK Prime Minister David Cameron. Here's the current UK Prime Minister. Let's listen to him.
It's just outside Glasgow. There's 350 wind turbines.
Did you hear that? It comes very quickly.
It's just outside Glasgow. There's 350 wind turbines there.
There's 350 wind turbines. 350 is definitely more than one. Wind turbines, plural form of the noun, and yet he says there's and not there are. Just in case there's any doubt left.
Yeah, well, because there's other things that we've done for nurses as well. Because you're right, it's not just about pay. There's lots of other ways.
You know that's not fair, don't you?
Well, there's other ways that we can demonstrate.
Yeah,
There's other things. There's lots of other ways. There's other ways. That leaves no doubt in my mind, as well as the many, many, many other speakers who use this in informal and formal situations. Speakers that you might find, that you might think are educated model speakers, and speakers who maybe you wouldn't think of as being that. It doesn't seem to matter. Everyone uses this. Theirs plus plural. My question then is, should we as teachers really be spending classroom time and students' energy and patience and goodwill on practicing this grammar point when model native speakers no longer make a distinction between theirs and there are? Will we still be teaching a difference between there is and there are 10, 20, 30 years from now? Or is this distinction something that's disappearing from the English language as it is spoken? Is anyone going to think any less of you and your ability in the English language if you just use theirs all the time? The second point I wanted to look at related to this is that, of course, you can say there're. Now, notice that I'm saying that you can say there're. Of course, we don't normally write this with an apostrophe like that. We know that. However, learning materials that we find in books and online like to tell us that theirs is common, but there doesn't exist. I've taken this example again from the British Council's Learning English website. You can see here, we can say theirs instead of there is. We often say this when we speak, but there is no short form for there are. In speaking, we're not talking about writing here. We say this when we speak. We're talking about spoken language. So they show us there's a restaurant in the station, but there are 2 cafes. There are 2 cafes is crossed out here on this little part that's talking about spoken language. Is it really true? Is it really correct to say that in spoken English there's no such thing as there are? Let's have a listen to some more people talking.
There are some critics on the left who...
Did you hear that?
There are some critics on the left who...
There are some critics on the left. That's more or less what I hear. Let's see if that's just one speaker, if that's just an isolated mistake that he made. Next person, different accent, different country. It's a younger woman.
Is helping me save money. And there are usually 4 things that people...
There are usually 4 things. Not there are usually 4 things. There are usually 4 things. Let's listen to one more person.
There are so many ways to become involved.
There are so many ways to become involved. So is it really true then to say that there are doesn't exist? That we do have a short contracted form of there is, which is theirs, but there is no short contracted form of the plural version there are. I've just heard 3 people, and I've heard hundreds and thousands more people in the past saying there are. This is widely used, and yet it never seems to appear in materials for learners. I want to look at the pronunciation of this in a little more detail. So often you'll find that the second R sound of there is barely pronounced. This depends a lot on accent, but for many North American speakers, something happens that's a little bit similar to how they pronounce the words horror, mirror, or error, which is that the 2 R's kind of run together and the vowel sound that comes between them almost disappears. So horror becomes horror, mirror becomes mirror, error becomes mirror, and there becomes there. Instead of me trying to imitate that, let's hear how these real North American speakers actually pronounce the words.
If we're only responding to the chaos, mayhem, horror.
Horror. You don't hear 2 separate R's with a vowel between them. What you hear is a kind of long R sound. Next speaker.
Wanted to hold me up and put the mirror in front of my face.
Put the mirror in front of my face. Again, you don't really hear the O between them. What you do get is a kind of lengthening of the liquid sound. And let's listen to one example of what we're focusing on, which is there.
And there are unseen creatures living all over your body.
Did you hear that again?
Why? And there are unseen creatures living all over your body.
There are unseen creatures. Now, while in rhotic North American accents, you might often hear something like this, there. In a non-rhotic accent, like the accents from the south of England specifically, in fact, most of England, you would probably have something more like there. Here's an example.
There are various theories.
There are various theories. So, given the evidence that we've just seen, is there really any reason for teachers like me to be telling learners of English that there is no short form of there are? We can tell them that we don't usually write it. In fact, that we never write it. Of course we don't write there are with an apostrophe like this. That's not a standard written form in English in the way that theirs is. But maybe we need to make it clear to our learners that in speaking we absolutely do say there are. The final point I wanted to look at was the way that we make a negative version of theirs. There isn't, or there's not. Now, of the learning materials that I was able to put my hands on without leaving the room, I have to say, so things that I have on the bookshelves behind me or on my computer or that I was able to find on the internet, all of them taught that the negative form of there is there isn't. Some of them mention there's not. Some of them don't mention it at all. If they do mention it, then it tends to be as an alternative form. It's somehow secondary to the normative form there isn't. Not once did I find an example of an exercise where there's not was the correct answer. Now, I wonder how the publishers and the writers of these educational materials have arrived at the decision to teach there isn't and to more or less ignore there's not. Is that based on having studied some corpus of the English language? If so, is that a corpus of spoken language or only written language? And is it an up-to-date corpus? Is it an up-to-date representation of the language? Now, I'll admit that I haven't done a corpus study of this either, except to look on Youglish, where you can find lots of clips of native speakers pronouncing different words. And on Youglish, I found for there isn't, in their database, almost 22,000 different examples of people saying there isn't, whereas they have almost 62,000 examples of there's not. It seems to me, and this is really just my own impression, I haven't studied this scientifically, that the there's not version is actually more common before quantifiers. So for example, there's not much, there's not a lot, there's not enough. But it appears very frequently in general in other types of phrases as well. In fact, if we look only at there isn't much and there's not much, there's not much appears with 4 times the frequency of there isn't much. So why is it that generally we are teaching there isn't above there's not, and mentioning there's not maybe as a kind of afterthought or a secondary form? Is it time to end the supremacy of there isn't and give there's not the recognition that it deserves? Okay, so what conclusions can we draw from all of this? Well, I'm going to look at some conclusions for this specific grammar point of theirs, and then maybe some conclusions more for English teaching and the way that we explain things to students and what we choose to teach students. First of all, I think this is the most important point. There's plus a plural noun appears to no longer be perceived as an error by English speakers. In speaking, really there's a good case for encouraging students just to use theirs all the time, not to spend too much energy on thinking about using one form with a plural noun and one with a singular or uncountable noun. You can pretty much, in speaking, just use theirs for everything. Another conclusion, both there is and there are usually take contracted and reduced forms in speaking. So we say theirs and their. And we've seen some examples of how even in quite formal speech, this is the case. You will sometimes hear there is and there are, but theirs and their are completely accepted and completely normal. Also, there's not is a perfectly common alternative to there isn't. It may even, depending on the situation, depending on the other words around it, be more common to use there's not than there isn't. Conclusions for English and the way we teach it in general. I think this is an area of English grammar that we're teaching wrong. I think we shouldn't be burdening learners with grammatical rules and pages of exercises to practice something that is really no longer relevant in the language and that most native speakers don't pay any attention to. Generally, I think teachers need to be thinking a little bit more about the relevance and the usefulness of what we're teaching, and that students need valid and up-to-date models of how language is really used. Otherwise, they'll never gain confidence. There'll be a kind of disconnect between what they're reading from the pages of a book and exercises that they're being made to do, compared with the language that they're really going to hear in the real world. The two things somehow don't line up and don't combine nicely. those are my thoughts. If you have any strong thoughts about the subject, I'm sure some people will. You can leave a comment, you can write me a little note. Even if you don't have anything specific to say, please do give a little like. It gives me great encouragement to know that someone's seen these things. And yeah, thanks very much and see you next time.